to reflect on one's soul with the unhealthy degeneracy of somatic reflection. As someone who has been advocating and practicing the discipline of somatic reflection for almost a decade, not only as a philosopher engaged in somaesthetics, but as a professional somatic educator and therapist in the Feldenkrais method, I obviously have a stake in defending somatic self-awareness and reflection. Having elsewhere made such a defense against condemnations of its asocial selfishness, unhealthy passivity, and ruination of effective action, let me here conclude my paper by focusing on how somatic self-awareness relates specifically to the tradition of self-knowledge and the issue of melancholia or depression. First, we should note that our Western philosophical tradition does contain some affirmations of reflective body consciousness. Nietzsche's critique of self-examining consciousness as unhealthy, as futile and delusional, partly because of the illusory nature of consciousness itself, finds a distinctive contrast in Nietzsche's recommendation to increase our self-knowledge with respect to corporeal matters. Affirming the body as, quote, an unknown sage within you that has more reason than in your best wisdom, Nietzsche urges us, I quote again, listen to the voice of the healthy body, end of quote. John Dewey, though well aware of the dangers of ruminating introspection, advocated and practiced the Alexander technique of conscious constructive control of the self that involves intense focusing on certain aspects of one's body posture and movement so as to understand more clearly our habitual modes of action and thought, and thus provide a better cognitive foundation for improving them. The meditation techniques used in recent research to demonstrate the healthful benefits of disciplined meditative self-consciousness for reducing anxiety, panic, and depression while promoting better emotions are in fact also techniques that essentially rely on deploying focused body consciousness, namely yoga, body scanning, and seated meditation, which involves intense concentration on one's breathing so as to distract the mind from other thoughts. This should not be surprising, since if yoga, Zen, and other systematic disciplines of somaesthetic introspection did indeed lead to the mental weakness, morbid introversion, and hypochondria that Kant and James feared, these methods would never have thrived for so many centuries and in so many different cultures. My own experience of Zen training in Japan has shown me how methodical somaesthetic reflection can develop one's power of volition by directing intensely focused consciousness to one's breathing or to other somatic feelings, such as the contact of one's feet with the floor in walking meditation. Willpower involves keeping attention firmly focused on an idea and resisting the mind's natural tendency to wander off target, either because of specific distractions induced by new sensations, or moving off target because of our habitual interests and thought associations. We are naturally and habitually inclined to devote attention to the outside world of flux and the ever-changing perceptions that it stimulates, not to the constant and imminent experience of breathing. Even if we momentarily attend to our breathing, our thought almost immediately tends to move on to other things. It is thus extremely difficult to compel one's attention to remain focused wholly on the experience of breathing itself or of any somatic process. Disciplines of sustained somaesthetic focusing can strengthen our will by training our attention to keep its concentration and resist its inclination to wander. Breathing and the body are wonderfully good topics or targets for such exercises of focusing attention because they are always there to focus on, while the mind typically ignores them in running off to more interesting or demanding objects in the outside world. When I began my meditation training, it was hard for me to keep my focus for more than a single breath. But after continued strenuous effort, I was able to sustain such concentration for much longer periods, yet do so with feelings of relaxed ease and pleasure. And my increased powers of attention could then be shifted beyond the breathing or meditative walking, so that everyday objects and familiar people were suddenly perceived with greater intensity, greater depth and accuracy. My movement and action, like my perception, became sharper, surer, and more satisfying. I conclude by confronting a lingering worry about the morbidity of somatic reflection. Christian, Platonist, and idealist arguments against attention to the body are often based on the body's essential imperfection, mortality, vulnerability, impurity, and general lowliness. In contrast to the inspiring nobility, immortality, or even divinity of the soul, reflective focus on one's bodily self promotes self-diminishment and self-loathing, whose only value would be to compel us to look higher to a sacred soul. But even without invoking such a soul, should not somatic self-focus necessarily tend to depress us by reminding us of the mortal flaws and limitations of our flesh? Only, I would argue, if we unrealistically expect a kind of purity and perfection that we have no right to expect, and whose absence should not therefore be a depressing disappointment. Without the presumption of divinely perfect bodies, immortally invincible and free from all pain, fatigue, or blemish, there is every reason to regard our somatic selves with grateful wonder and enthusiastic curiosity for the vulnerable yet astoundingly complex and well-functioning organization of biological, social, psychological, and cultural materials that we indeed are. There is also a more radical and paradoxical way to counter the fear of somatic reflection, revealing imperfections that diminish self-worth and lead us to melancholy. And that is the Buddhist option of using somatic self-reflection for denying the ultimate reality of a substantial, autonomous, fully owned individual self that we could be deeply depressed about. The self's apparent permanence and individuality is, in this method, through focused body consciousness, mindfully dissolved into a porous, messy welter of different elements, liquids, solids, and gases, whose transitory and changing collaboration gives rise to the temporary, fragile construct we identify as the somatic self, and falsely opposed to the rest of the material and social world, from which the self is temporarily constructed, and without whose materials and energies it could never be. So let me close this talk with a passage from one of the Buddha's sermons advocating heightened mindfulness of body. And I quote from the Buddha on mindfulness of the body. A bhikkhu reflects on this very body enveloped by the skin and full of manifold impurity, from the soul up and the hair down, thinking thus: there are in this body hair of the head, hair of the body, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bones, marrows, kidney, heart, liver, midriff, spleen, lungs, intestines, mesentery, stomach, feces, bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, grease, saliva, nasal mucus, synovial fluid, urine. Thus the bhikkhu lives observing the body. End of quote. So concludes the Buddha, knowing that such self-knowledge is far from a recipe for melancholia, but instead a release from ultimately depressing illusions of the self's substantial permanence that make us take our individual selves with too much of the wrong kind of seriousness and selfishness, forgetting the bonds to others that so much define us. Nothing too much echoes the second Delphic maxim, which is a good place to end this long lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shusterman, for for this inspiring and incredibly big in territory, so to speak, lectures. So I'm sure there will be lots of questions, and let us have 7 minutes break, that we can get some air into the room, and please come back for the panel discussion and your questions to Professor Shusterman and to the panel.
I won't be able to join you until this because I have some family obligation, and I try now to join it.
It's not just a living. So yeah, I mean, there's a practical.